That's right, dear listeners. Another flash episode of The Dark Zone. This is done the evening in which Worlds in Paraguay is finished up. We know the podium. We know who the top 7 to 10 are going to be. We're joined by Craig Cook of AR Live Coverage, Jason Magness of Bend Racing, and Brent Freedland of Rootstock Racing. Thanks, fellas, for coming on the show. We appreciate it. There is some breakup during the episode when Craig is speaking. He is in New Zealand after all, but it does not get in the way too much. So bear with it. Listen to it. Thank you to these guys for coming on board. We really appreciate them joining the Dark Zone. Enjoy this flash episode. Sit back and relax. This is a good one. A full hour of race coverage from Worlds. Thank you, everybody. Keep up the great work and see you out there. Welcome back, listeners, to the Dark Zone Adventure Racing Podcast. This is your host, Brian Gatens. We are on the tail end of the Adventure Racing World Championship from Paraguay. We've assembled a crack team of analysts. We've brought Craig and Brent back from our Flash podcast opening, and we have Jason Magness joining us. So we have Craig from New Zealand, AR Live Coverage. We have Brent from Philadelphia with Rootstock Racing, and Jason Magness all the way from Bend as part of Bend Racing. It's been a fantastic race, a lot to follow. These three gentlemen have watched it much more closely than I have. I appreciate them coming on the show today. Fellas, it's like eating an elephant, this race, right? Talking about it. A lot happens over 5 days, one bite at a time. Before we get into the details, Jason, I know that you know a lot about the Team Bend's final races. Craig, you've been watching closely. Brent, you've been watching closely. By the way, shout out to Barbara Campbell. Tried to get her to join tonight, but she is in her Wi-Fi free cabin. So she's the real winner out of all of this. Barbara Campbell, we miss you. We have to get you on the show soon enough. First things first, Craig, coming to you. Talk about the course. You've covered a lot of world championships. How do you rate the course? Hard, easy, in between? What do you think?
Pretty standard, I guess, for a world championship. It was, it was tougher than it looked on paper, obviously, and they often are. And obviously, hats off to Brent for picking the time estimates and such things there, bang on. And yeah, I think even Nathan probably underestimated it a little bit. I think he was expecting to crack it in under 4 days. So yeah, it was interesting. I thought probably the best feedback on the course was probably Chris Vaughan when he crossed the finish line, and there was a video clip there of him, and he sort of didn't enjoy the first track very much. Said it was pretty long and almost a little bit boring. I think for Chris, it just lacked a little bit of challenge, and by the end of it, they were pretty smashed. And then he said, it got more interesting as it went along, and there was some more nav challenges along the way on those second and third tracks in particular, and he enjoyed it a lot more. I think someone like Chris, obviously, it's hard for a race director to design a course that's going to challenge Chris but be achievable for everybody else. But he certainly enjoyed the later nav and such things. So, I think it was pretty much, I guess you'd call it maybe a standard world championship course. Certainly not the longest or the toughest, but a good one. And it certainly kept the teams close, kept things interesting. And yeah, it was a good race.
Sounds great. Brent, what was your take on the course, having watched it from afar?
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of that. I was rewatching a little clip this afternoon with Abby, who didn't get to watch much. And it was actually when Avaya was heading out on that second trek, and we're behind Swedish Armed Forces, and they were interviewing everybody, and they were talking to Simone, and she actually had a similar comment. It was a little more vague. She didn't reference a specific stage, but had kind of pointed out that up till that point, they didn't feel like there was much route choice, and it was, pretty straightforward. So I think that certainly seemed true until we got to that second trek. And I remember we talked about how that second trek might be more pivotal. I was surprised that the first trek actually seemed as straightforward as it did. I think I would have expected more chaos from the top teams, but from what I saw, and there were so many dots to follow on that first stage that it was a little bit hard and overwhelming to really, see what was going on big picture. But I didn't see a lot of disasters. I know some of the less experienced teams struggled a bit out there in terms of keeping themselves found, but I didn't really notice any top teams having issues that seemed to stem from navigation. So that was a little surprising. But then I mean, man, that last stage, which I imagine Jason's going to enlighten us on in a minute, you look at that stage and you see Avaya, crush it, take care of business, move slightly faster than the projections. And then you see like the next two, like the two top ranked teams in the world take 3 times as long to get through it. Right. I mean, that was a pretty spectacular little stage that they saved for the end.
Jason, thanks for coming all the way from Bend. New to the analyst team here. Good to have you. What's your take on the course?
Yeah, I mean, as primarily a racer and also race director, so I kind of, feel like I'm right with Ertzi. That he's a very competent, excellent racer as well. I think it's very interesting, and I'm wondering what he thought about in designing the course, because to me it was pretty brilliant in the sense that the first 2 stages were pretty much purely physical, right? But what that allowed to happen is for a lot of these teams to push themselves to the edge of their physical capacity, and then bam, all of a sudden on that next trek, they were exhausted. They'd been pushing the pace, and things fell apart for most of the teams, right? At least in some answer. And if they didn't in that stage, there was another trekking stage with difficult navigation, and then there was another difficult, so there was basically like 3 O courses toward the end of this race after teams had been kind of lulled into this sense where it was all about speed and power, right? And so as a racer, I know that there's a lot of those teams out there that were really pushing and like, oh, we're up here in the front, we're doing really well, and then you just saw these teams collapse because they didn't manage their sleep, they didn't manage their nutrition, they didn't manage something, and then like we saw a number of teams. Life Impetech is Life Aventura. Like they're one of those teams that was up there at the top with Avaya, with these teams till halfway through the stage, halfway through the race, and then they're not even finished yet. They're like going to finish 2 days behind the leaders, probably. And they're known as a really fast team, but it's when that navigation comes at the end, and I'm sure we'll get to talk a lot about like what happened with Avaya and where where they actually won the race. But to me, as a course design, it is pretty fascinating that it was fast and furious. It was just this pure physical thing at the beginning. And then it's not really till the second half of the race that, that the navigation had to shine. And for a lot of teams, it was too late to switch gears because they were already too tired. So
to give a sense for the listener of how hard that first stage was, 32 hours is roughly the number that was being bandied about is how long it would take. There were now the lead teams did it very strong, and to your point, physical, strong, tough trek. There were teams that were coming in over 70 hours that were out there for days at a time, and that was the first stage, 122 kilometers at 70 hours. So I think you're spot on that a big trek, then a big paddle, really served to soften teams up. And by the time they got later on in the race, that's when everything else had to take over.
And that first trek and paddle, what that did is it really established who the elite athletes were. And I don't mean any disrespect to the people at the back of the field, but like that first, it's like an ultra marathon, and then an ultra paddle, right? Which basically asks the question of like, who are the actual elite endurance athletes in this field, right? Who are the ones that can actually keep going and make short work of this and finish in 30, 40 hours, and then do the paddle in 10 or 15 hours with a little bit of sleep. And, we had a clearly established, if you look at the tracking, like there were only 25 teams out of this whole field that were able to really do that in any reasonable amount of time, right? And so to those at the back, they may have had some success in other expeditions, but, you kind of got to wonder, like they don't necessarily need more navigation. They just need more speed, more physicality if they're going to be competitive on a world course.
Right. Coming over to you now. Talk a bit about that second trek. We talked a lot about how the first trek, athleticism, you had the big paddle, then you had that O course right there. We began to see some spread on teams that were Avaya, and let's not bury the lead, Avaya World Champion again. I mean, the penalties are going to come up, but at the end of the day, like I told Craig before we started recording, the penalties are pushed to the side, right? The win was so resounding that the penalties ended up really meaning nothing at the final result. I'm sure in the race, they felt like a bigger deal. What was your take on that second trek in the teams and how that separated teams out there?
Yeah, I mean, I'll actually kind of loop back a little bit to what Jason was just saying as well. And really, it's only a comment for Avaya, so we can dive into Avaya to some degree here. Clearly the second trek had more of the tricky navigation we talked about a week ago, when Craig and I were on and both reflecting on what we've seen over 4 or 5 of these races before. That first stage was really surprising to me, as I already said. And then the second one, you started to see those top teams really start to struggle, right? And some of that was the fact those lead teams went in there kind of in the evening, so they were doing a lot of it in the dark, and it was nighttime. But even, the next day, as teams were in there in daylight, you could see that they were struggling, whereas Avaya didn't. So that was huge, right? Like that totally changed the nature of the race. The other thing that struck me, which, this is one of those like fly on the wall, you have no idea. I think back to Avaya over the last 10 years, right? In race after race, I feel like there's a point where you hear from Nathan, who I really admire for how honest he is when he, reflects on his races and his team. And one of the things I just remember him always kind of pointing out was like I've never heard or seen them really push themselves, right? And I'm not saying they don't push themselves, but he often will make a comment that they were racing their own race, and that even the other top teams around them, they look at them and they're like, they're working really hard and we're just steady, right? And so, watching Avaya I don't even know now, it was Tuesday, I guess, when they kind of fell behind a little bit with the penalty. And then they just seemed to be like hanging on with Swedish Armed Forces, and those two teams were side by side for almost 24 hours, right? And I'm sitting there watching, and I think a lot of people around the world were kind of wondering, all right, have we actually seen that moment, or are we watching that moment where we see some kind of chink in the armor, right? Or maybe they can't quite keep up with this really strong physical Swedish team. And then they just took over the race, right? And so back to Jason's point, like I'm left wondering, were they doing what they have always done, right? And yes, they are the like really strong elite athletes that Jason's alluding to, and that's what they're able to do. They're able to push, but are they also holding something in reserve, and are they capable of taking things to a higher level that no one really can for the rest of the race? So my final thing, and I'll turn it over to Craig, is the other thing that just really surprised me at that point is I'm not sure Avaya had dramatically more sleep than Swedish Armed Forces to that point, right? They both slept on the river. They both slept overnight. Avaya might have gotten an extra hour in one of those sleeps, maybe both. But then from that point forward, I don't think Avaya really stopped until they were forced to stop at that transition at the end. And that kind of, floored me, because that's usually how they win the race, in my opinion, is they manage to manage sleep in a way that no one else seems to be able to. And I didn't feel like they actually could do that in this race, and it didn't seem to matter.
Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. Just going back to the first trek, there was a moment in there that was quite pivotal. I felt that where there was a couple of mistakes, and it was just after dark. It was about 7:30, 8 o'clock. If you actually replay the tracking, it's really quite interesting. I think it was just after CP7. Estonia, SAF, and Sickles Hunt, Honey Power all went off a little ridge, and they lost about 20 minutes. And then just after CP8, Merrill, who was still with Avaya, took a left turn, and they lost probably 10, 15 minutes. All of a sudden, it's like a little gap opened up. Avaya were just sitting back. They just all of a sudden moved through the pack, and then they saw the opportunity, and they just took off. And they opened up a substantial gap, and it was out to like about 5 kilometres during that trek, which is quite a bit during the night. In the next morning, I think it stayed pretty constant. And by that stage, and I think by the end of the trek, they were starting to suffer too. So the pace had probably dropped off a little bit. But I mean, they essentially got off that trek with an hour and a half ahead of Life Adventure and 2 hours ahead of SAF. And unfortunately, they then got the penalty. Well, not unfortunately, but obviously they got a penalty, which they had to serve. And they got on the river, about an hour before the other teams. They did bank an extra hour, I feel, on the river. But instead of getting and maintaining that gap, the penalty sort of brought the field back to them. and they got off the water all at the same time. And I think mentally that was actually really, really tough for Avaya. I think that hurt them quite badly, and it actually took them probably 24 hours to get over it and recover from it before they sort of got the strategy together to put pedal to the metal and carry on and do what they wanted to do. But that penalty really, really hurt them, I think. Otherwise, they would have got that gap, they would have maintained it, and it would have been status quo, transmission as usual, and they would have just done what they've done the last 2 or 3 times, I feel.
They come off the water right around hour 47.
Yeah.
In your own recollection, Avaya was known for their resounding success. You think it rattled them looking around at hour 47 and a lot of teams being in their orbit?
Yeah, definitely. It's they'd done the work to get that gap, to get on the water well in advance, bank more sleep, probably get off the water still with an hour advantage, and then just carry on and polish off the course, which would have been their strategy, I believe. But it brought them back to the pack, and I think, as I say, I think mentally it was probably quite tough for them, and then because it was a battle after that, they had to actually fight for it, and that definitely changed their race strategy and put a chink in their armor, I think, for a little while, but ultimately it had no effect.
Yeah.
So having that happen to them, and we could talk about Avaya a whole lot. The other teams that were chasing after them, where do you think the pivotal moment came for them in the race where it became clear that they were now fighting for second and third place? Did it happen as far back as that second trek? Did the other penalty for Avaya later on in the race play a role there? Like, what got in the way of SAF? What got in the way of Estonia? Was it the sleep? Was it the fatigue? What do you think was the deal for them?
Well, I mean, so one thing I just want to point out, just to kind of be clear, because I talked to some of the referees and some of the people at the race. Like, I think it's good to not consider that first hour with Avaya as a penalty, because it really was a time equalization. Like, they missed something that took teams 35 minutes with the ropes.
Yeah,
it's fine. And then in the referee's discretion, they said, okay, we can't just give them 35 minutes because they get to sit here and rest, and everybody needs rest. So they average it out. Most teams are 40 minutes. So they said, we're going to give them an hour. Right. And I'm sure it felt bad to Avaya, but it really, it allowed them to rest. So they essentially were going forward with more rest than all the other teams. So it was a good equalization. I really think that was a good thing. So the real penalty came with them losing the tracker, and, going back, that they did that second track basically neck and neck with SAF and Avaya, or SAF and Estonia. Like, they all finished that track at the same time. And that's when Avaya got that penalty. And what I'm really curious of, which I haven't got confirmed, until I talked to SAF or Estonia, is like, if those teams knew about the penalty, right? Because that to me is the interesting question, because if they don't know about the penalty, then they certainly feel pressure to try to stay with Avaya regardless of sleep, because they think they're on equal footing, right? If they know about the penalty, maybe, who knows, like maybe they decided to try to stay with them, or they should have tried to sleep. But Avaya certainly knew that they could not sleep until they got to the penalty box, right? So they basically had their race strategy forced upon them. It was like, hey, if you guys are going to win this race, at least in their minds, it had to be, we have to get to the penalty box and sleep for 2 hours. And watching that next track, like the Swedes led that whole next bike, right? So it wasn't until that third trek of the race, and the Swedes left on that third track ahead of Avaya, and then they were basically neck and neck. And then there was a 2 kilometer section. I want to say it's between checkpoint 67 and 68, like literally a 2 kilometer section. They were at 67 together. The Swedes made an error and headed north. And by the time they got to 68, which was literally 2 kilometers away, Avaya had put an hour on SAF, right? And it was over. Like, at that point, once you lose sight of Avaya in these races, like, it doesn't matter how motivated you are, like, you just know that Chris Forn is not going to make the same mistakes. Even little mistakes, they add up, right? Like, SAF could have, navigated excellently, but somehow Chris is going to pull 5 minutes out on this checkpoint, and 10 minutes out on this checkpoint, and 5 minutes out on this checkpoint. And in a race with 100 more 50 more checkpoints, that, like, at that point, when I saw that, even though they only had gained an hour and they needed to gain 2, it was just like, that's it. If you can gain 1 hour in checkpoints that are 2 kilometers apart, There's just nobody that can navigate like those guys, especially when they're tired. And it was remarkable to watch them turn, equal footing, 50 something hours, 71 hours into the race to a win by 10 or whatever it is, 6 hours. It's just like, it's crazy.
For those at home, if you want to go back and look at that, go into the tracker. Our 83.37 is the section you're talking about right there, Jason. How they basically came into that section neck and neck. They go a little bit north, right? As Swedish Saf goes north, catches, comes back down. By the time they caught themselves, Avaya put the pedal down and off they went. Really, and to your point, excellent analysis. That is the moment in the race that Avaya just never looked back from there.
Yeah.
Brent, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I echoing a lot of that, but just to look at a couple numbers more closely, just to kind of put some of this in perspective, right? At TA 5, right, when they came into that trek, they were at 77 hours of racing, with Swedish Armed Forces being technically 20, well, less than 20, but basically 20 minutes ahead, right? By the end of the race, right, Avaya finished in 102 hours, which ended up being 9 hours ahead of Swedish Armed Forces, right? And also remember, Estonia was in striking distance. They were only an hour behind the two of them at that point. So you basically had 3 teams all within, basically a statistical tie for this kind of race at that point. So within essentially 24 hours, Avaya puts on 9 hours on Swedish Armed Forces and ultimately put on, almost 20 on Estonia, right? Like, that's just unbelievable. And so, the other thing I was going to just observe is, the same video that I mentioned earlier where Simone was talking about the course. I remember watching that video. They're walking out of TA, right? Like, Swedish Armed Forces is ahead of them going out on this trek. Swedish Armed Forces is running out of TA. And Avaya is walking down a road, eating, talking to Team Ferris from Ecuador, who had dropped out, talking to the film crew, being gracious with their time. And I remember just looking at it, and I think I even posted on Attack Fund. I was like, they do not look like they have a whole lot of urgency. And I wasn't saying that in a critical way. It was more just like an observation of, it's not what I would have expected for a team at that point. And I just think that speaks so much to their ability to control the race. And so I'm not sure I really personally think that they were rattled. But I think, Nathan alluded to this at the finish line, like they had to change their strategy in the middle of the race, which I don't know that any other team could really do that the way they were able to in this race, to be able to then put away these top teams in the last 24 hours. But I think it was totally intentional. I think they coasted through that bike ride in the start of that trek. They were preparing for the night. They knew they were going to make that move overnight on that trek. They executed it as they hoped. Swedish Armed Forces, helped a little bit in making the bobble, but I'm not sure it would have mattered. The Swedish Armed Forces, I just think, didn't have what Avaya had left in the tank at that point.
I think Avaya was just waiting, on some level, you just can imagine like Chris and Nathan and, they've been racing for 20 years. And the reality is they know that people that don't have sleep are going to make bobbles, right? So I don't know that it was that exact point, but I think you're right. They were just with the Swedes, and they're just they know that as soon as, that they're going to make a mistake at some point. Right. And that Chris, I don't know, it's easy to view him as like some superhuman mythical navigation figure, but the reality is that is who he is, right? In this sport, he is the guy that just somehow doesn't make these mistakes or recognizes them so much faster that it doesn't seem like it. And
go ahead, Craig.
In this, that interview with Simone was fascinating, actually, and she alluded to it also, where she said, we're going into the trek tonight. We sort of hope there's some really tricky navigation in there and such things. So they were just cruising along, having a chat, and just waiting for it to get dark, and then they were going to do what they do. But as I said earlier about that first trek, when all of a sudden they just put the pedal down at night and just put a gap on the other teams. And I mean, the other teams maintain their speed. Avaya were actually able to accelerate. And I mean, there's no other team that can do that, and there's no one else that can match it. And then I also did a post on the critical section on the third trek, and their navigation was just
Craig, hold on one second there, Craig.
They missed a turnoff and lost half an hour, and that's when Avaya caught up.
Yeah. Craig, you broke up there a little bit. Try to rewind 30 seconds and say that again.
Okay, so yeah, they were going into that third track, and SAF missed a turnoff to, I think it was checkpoint 65 or 66, something like that, and they lost half an hour. And then all of a sudden, Avaya were right with them, and I think it was checkpoint 67 where Avaya had a 10-minute gap. SAF actually went dark for an hour, their tracker, or it did on my tracking anyway. And when it came to again, they were a kilometre away from 68 down in a creek to the east-northeast, and it was just like, holy crap, what happened there, and that was it. But Avaya just executed that stage with so much precision. They just went point to point to point, and they were out of there. And yeah, by the time they left that trekking section, they had 2.5 hour lead, which nullified the penalty, and then they just pressed it home, and the rest is history, as they say, I guess. And so it's the night navigation that, from this race in particular, I've noticed they are just so much faster than everyone else that people, they just can't compete with it. And they know that they can get to that point of the race at some stage, put the hammer down at night, put a gap on everyone, and it's good night nurse and race over.
It's amazing how Avaya can just do that. But, there were over 50 teams out there, right? And Avaya, we led with them because they deserve to be spoken of first, right? Because they had so much going on out there on the course. They did so well, so decisively. And to your gentleman's credit, you've been watching the videos and been talking to people on the ground there. So while we have some speculation here, we're firm in some of the things that we know and understand. And thank you, Jason, for recognizing and pointing out that was a penalty, was actually time equalization, that they did the math and said, let's make it fair and off we go.
Yeah.
Question about strategy that we saw there. I think for the developing racer that's out there, and this is a bit of I'm extending this idea going into the conversation, and this may be wrong, SAF running out of the transition and Avaya walking out of the transition. Do you think Avaya and SAF? Go ahead, Craig.
It's almost like Avaya treated that first part still as transition. They were still transitioning as they were walking along, eating, fueling up, ready for the track, and preparing themselves. So yeah, I guess that's maybe just a slightly different approach.
Gotcha. And they saw the big picture, right? They had to go into that section, somewhat fed, slowing down a little bit, making sure they're feeling okay, and off they go into that. And so congratulations, Avaya, completely decisive victory, world champions again. We saw pictures of Nathan with his eye bandaged. We saw pictures of everyone sort of hobbling around a little bit, and it was dressed like a pirate day in Paraguay. So good job, Nathan, on doing that. We're proud of you. A lot of other stories in this race, a lot of other people going out there. Who else we want to talk about? Jason, Bend. Let's talk about it. What a result for them. Holy cow. Go America.
Yeah, I mean, it was, before we get right to Bend, to me, I think it was cool that this race had basically, I can learn a lot from it as a racer, as an expedition racer, especially because you had the same story that was happening with Avaya happening, with the top 5, happening with the top 10, still happening with the top 10, and really, I think it comes down to, just that understanding of capability and pacing, which Estonia and the Swedes clearly don't have as well as Avaya, right? I can't help but think if Estonia had stopped and slept for 3 hours, they would have got third. There's just no way. They burned so much time being sleep deprived and not willing to sleep because they were afraid of what they were going to lose. And then they lost it anyway. Right. I mean, it's the same thing with the Swedes potentially. And it's the same thing with Merrill Songlines. We just saw this story play out again and again and again of not really recognizing the capacity. And that I think is the crazy thing about expedition racing. There is this moment when, as a navigator or as a team leader, where you actually, this is studied by science, where you actually feel like you're doing well, you're sleep deprived, but you actually have this completely false sense of your ability. Right. And you think you're navigating well, you think you're moving fast, you think all these things are happening, but anybody from the outside could look at you and say, you are messed up and nothing is working for you. Right. And so I think the really good teams, have somebody on that team that can recognize that and be dude, if we take an hour nap, we're going to gain back that time so fast right? And then you see these, Estonia has done it 2 years in a row, right? Where they're just like, they're such a good team. But once you exceed that capacity and you think you're doing well, but you're not, like Life Adventure is a great example in this team. They're so fast. And they went from like in that top pack to maybe, top 15.
Yeah.
They've fallen so far back. And I just talked to Chelsea, briefly, and she was like, for a while they were with Life Impotech, and Life Impotech was just desperately trying to follow them because they had no idea basically what country they were in, right? It's like,
right, they're just upside down, right? It all just caught up with them.
Like at some point, and then Life Impotech got to checkpoint for him and they got all upset. And then before long, they just see Life Impotech like just wandering around, completely lost again, right? And so, that's just a matter of, it's such a fascinating sport to me because there is a physical, physicality and a physical ability and endurance and speed that is super important. And then, what I think, Avaya and I think Ben did a great job this time of figuring out, although they almost lost at the end, but it was pretty exciting to see what teams are taking care of themselves enough to keep racing. And, you've had this experience, Brian, where you think that the transition area is close. You're like, think the stage is almost over. You think the finish line is almost over. And like, you let down your guard and like, we're just going to push it. And then all of a sudden a stage that should take 4 hours takes 12 hours. Like we just saw that happen in this race over and over and over again. Like, oh, they're almost done. But like, actually, no.
And you just bleed time. It's amazing how the clock speeds up, and we see it time with navigators, right? Their confidence goes up and their capacity goes down, right? Mm-hmm. And coming back to your race earlier, and poor Team Eastwind had a really rough race this race. I think heartbreaking what kind of race they had. If we rewind a little bit and we go back to Expedition Oregon, Team Eastwind took the sleep more philosophy, and it served them very well during your race.
Right, and it becomes that balance. In Expedition Oregon, we saw Vitorade, which is a world's top team, basically comes so close to imploding, right? They were pushing that sleep envelope and, basically thinking they were going to finish the course in 3 days instead of 5.5. And, Eastwind was slow and steady and slept probably 10 hours more than Vitorade, was like within 20 minutes of them. And honestly, the only thing that kept Eastwind from winning that race was not adapting, which is what Avaya is really good at. So, Eastwind could have been served by saying, hey, we don't need 2 more hours sleep. We can take an hour sleep and win this race, but they were so stuck in their idea of sleep that they weren't able to pull it out. And that's what was really cool with Avaya is we saw that they were able to do both, right? They were able to like have their sleep and bank it and be ahead and then not. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was like the Bend racing. Oh my God, the end of that, like watching them get lost on the last checkpoint was pretty excruciating. So yeah, I mean, I did hear, I just heard from them that, again, this is sleep deprivation, but they literally went, I think it was checkpoint 94, the second to last checkpoint. It was a cave, and they found the cave and they went into the cave and they went pretty deep in the cave and they didn't find the checkpoint. And so they came out of the cave and they thought maybe it's a different cave. They started wandering around for an hour looking for another cave. And then they finally went back to the cave. And Chelsea was like, we need to go deeper in the cave. And they went deeper in the cave, probably 50 meters deeper than they went the last time, around a little rocky thing. And there was the checkpoint. So they literally were there and then left it because they were worried about getting past. Like, oh, it's got to be a different cave, right? But that's the mind, right? And luckily, like Merrill also got there and they didn't actually find the cave. They were still looking for the cave. So it was like this crazy thing watching on the track of these teams that have been racing for 120 hours within 2 kilometers of the finish line, completely like losing their scope of reality and almost, losing that placement. So, obviously they were very, very excited to make that game. But, I think Ben, I talked to Ben and they made 3 of those errors during the race where they basically were at the checkpoint and then second guessed themselves and then wandered around for a while. And eventually ended up right back where they were at the checkpoint. And they're like, oh, it's like right here. Like the other one that Ben talked about was, and this is my favorite thing, is my least favorite thing in some of these world races in South America is the picture checkpoint, right? I've in Ecuador before, I've had problems where there was the checkpoint was take a picture of this power pole on the ridge. And so, unfortunately, you get to the ridge and there's a ton of power poles. And so you take a picture of the power pole that you think is the right one. And then the instructions say, follow the little trail down from the power pole down into the steep ravine. So you find a tiny trail that goes into the steep ravine, but then you feel like you're going to die because it's one power pole further, right? And there's another trail there. And so, at one point they got to a waterfall with a ladder in it, right? But the ladder did not look, the ladder had been changed. They confirmed this, like the ladder had been changed from when the picture was taken. So they got to a waterfall with a ladder in it, but they were like, that's not the same ladder that's in the picture on our passport. So we can't take that. And so then they wander around, and then there's waterfalls and ladders, and there's like, where's the exact ladder to take the picture? And in the end, they're like, just take a damn picture of the ladder and go, right? But in their mind, they're like, oh, this ladder's got 5 rungs instead of 4. This can't be the right ladder, but it's a huge amphitheater with a waterfall that's at the right point. Anyway, so it's one of those things that and add to that sleep deprivation, right? And, 2 navigators that think different things, and they had some fun out there from what they said, just those little minute details. But I'm obviously pleased that they were able to pull it out, and that now I can sleep tonight. So that's good.
So Brent, I'm going to come to you in a second to talk a bit about some of the teams that were outside the top 5 in that top 10. I know we watched very closely those teams. Before that, though, I want to go back to you, Jason. Let's give the tail of the tape. Bend Racing, their placement, what it means for American racers, their team composition. I know you talked a bit on Facebook about it. Tell us now, what exactly did Bend Racing accomplish with their finish?
It's something we've been searching for or training for I don't know, almost a decade. They are the top American team in the race, but they are also the highest placement at World Championships for an all-American team. Adventure Medical Kits has been very well known. They haven't been racing for a while, but even they had an Australian navigator. So they pulled in Rob Preston from Australia as their primary navigator for years. And achieved pretty high results in the World Championships, never beating Avaya. But it's been a long time since we saw an American team in the top 10. I think the last time an all-American team was in the top 10 was in 2014 in Ecuador, when I was there with Dan and Chelsea and Eric Sanders. But as this sport kind of goes towards more of that national feel, like with the 3 teammates and the same nationality required, which is nice. It makes it a little bit more exciting to root for, a little bit more dynamic. It's a big deal. I think we're very, very excited. We've been training for it for a long time. And I'm really proud of Van and Chelsea and Dusty and Emily for kind of doing that. And it's really nice to see the Americans, a lot of American teams, Rootstock included, just like pushing back towards expeditions and wondering what it takes to not just finish these races, but to be competitive. The other pretty exciting thing that Chelsea was really excited about was, I think they were the top team in the World Championships with a 2 female, 2 male ratio. Which is like, it's not the biggest deal, but it is nice to see more top women in the sport. And traditionally it's rarely seen that kind of makeup wins these races or does well in these, top 5 or top 10 in these races.
Well, on that same note, by virtue of calendars where they had to go, the U.S. ARA National Championships came right before the World Championships. And Rootstock Racing, an all-female team of Abby Purkis, Karen Delaney, and Nikki Driscoll, had the highest placement ever at a national championship for a 3-person, a 3-woman team. So I agree with you. I think that there's we don't want to point too much in the fact that these races speak to an overall trend, but it's safe to say that with the growth of American adventure racing, seeing this kind of success on the national and international field says a lot about the direction that we're going.
And I was at nationals, and honestly, like I remember seeing Abby and her team come into transition, and I was like, while we were still in the transition, I was like, are you guys still full course? And they were like, yeah. And we're like, oh, awesome. Crazy. Right. We raced with the newcomer, Amanda Boley. That was like, any US race teams that want to pick up Amanda, she's amazing. It's really just cool to see women being more interested in, and because they're super capable. So yeah, I'm all for that progression in the US adventure racing scene.
So 100+ hour race, all these miles, 1,000 stories out there, right? Teams, I mean, let's talk about American teams. Team Disability, right? They're still out there slugging away right now. I think right now they're pushing a bike. They were on that first trek for over 70 hours. And, they had to unfortunately join the short course teams. If you're still out there, you're pretty much short coursed. And I know that Luis, who's on their team, his bike is broken and they appear to be running it across Paraguay now, right? So a million stories going on out there. Brent, what jumped out at you during the race? What are we seeing out there story-wise with other teams?
Well, yeah, I want to go back to the top. I know we've spent a lot of time at the top, but like huge shout out to Brazil, right? I know all the three of us talked about Brazil as like our odd man out of the podium. I think all three of us kind of agreed that they were going to probably be the runner up to the podium. And it really looked like that was what it was going to be. And I think Nick, at the finish line, Nick was talking about how basically going into that last stage, that's what they were settling for. Not that they were stopping to race, but they were like, we're racing for fourth place. And then, of course, unfortunately, their tracker died on us. So we had nothing to go by except that we could see that Estonia was falling apart, right? And we knew that Brazil was close enough that maybe they had pulled it off. And I don't know if any of the three of you had the chance to watch it and kind of see it relatively close to live time, but all of a sudden, right, ARWS goes live like they did with Avaya, which was a super cool function, by the way. I thought it was really fun to be able to like actually travel the last, 15 to 45 minutes, depending on who they were catching when. But they catch, the Brazil team at the end coming in, and just watching those guys finish, knowing that they had managed to get back to the podium, the highest finish ever for a Brazilian team, and just the kind of the pride and joy of that, and how the experience, I think, navving in Paraguay really helped them catch up to Estonia and pass them. That was just, that was awesome. That was maybe like the best storyline of the race for me.
It's a classic case of not giving up.
Yeah.
Right. Hanging around long enough. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Brent, I want to point out, we had our pre-race predictions that we went through here. And it's worth pointing out that I have a cross out here. You picked Avaya for the win. All three of us did. You picked Saf for second. Good job. Your original pick for third was Brazil, and you had me cross it out and put down Estonia. So you almost got the podium all correct there, Brent, but there's always next year.
Next.
But to the point, Brazil is an example of the fact of stay in the race, keep yourself moving, stay navigating, stay smart. And sometimes other teams are your best teammates. They help you out, right? They have a really challenging time and you're able to pass them at the finish line. So good for them.
Yeah. No, it was
Craig, about you? There's some teams out there that you loved.
Yeah, no, I think one of the other key things, and Jason touched on it too, was just strategy. And it was very chalk and cheese this race. There were the group that went with the leaders as always, and then there were the ones that started off a little bit slower and came through later on. And, Merrill and Adventure Life have fallen apart a little bit and dropped well back. But I think Merrill, if you're going to give yourself a chance for top five, you've got to go hard pretty early. And they did that, and they've hung in pretty well. And, yeah, they've been picked up by a few teams in the last day or so and have dropped down a little bit. But if you want to try for podium or top five, then you got to go pretty hard early. I think a lot of the other teams and USWE and Quest, have come home and finished really well, great strategies and such things. And all those teams, I guess, had top 10 aspirations, and both strategies kind of worked. But they're probably not going to get top five or podium. But at the same time, it can really blow apart for a few teams. And obviously, Honey Power from Estonia, I see they've dropped well back. Nordisk, they're still just possible top 10, so they might still sneak in there as well, along with Life Adventure may still be around the top 10 mark. But I was really pleased for Life Adventure, actually, because I've picked them a couple of times before to do quite well because they're such a strong team, but they've started off slowly and just never really gained much ground, finished 22nd last year. So I was actually really pleased for them to actually just roll the dice and go with the leaders and just see how long they could hang in there and actually give themselves a chance, I guess, where in the past they haven't. And yeah, it looks like they might end up just outside the top 10, but at least they gave it a crack. So I do. The most amazing performance for me in the whole race is Black Hill. Those guys were mid-pack at best halfway through the first trek. They finished the first trek 10 hours or 10 and a half hours behind the leaders. And they have passed every other team in the top 20 apart from the top 4. And that's just phenomenal. You got to wonder a little bit, okay, if they went a little bit faster earlier, could they have podium? But their race strategy really is conservative to start with. I don't think they sleep in transitions. They seem to get in and out of transitions really quick and pass teams in transition. But then they're just steady. And their time, only 40 minutes slower than SAF from the kayak onwards for the whole course is testament to that. They're a good team and they're fast and they navigate really well. But interesting strategy. And it was really obvious in this race. There were the ones that went out hard early, faded, some held out in there. Merrill Songlines, I thought, did have a great race. And I mean, they'll be dangerous in Africa next year. Look out. They'll be the Brazil of next year. They'll be pushing for podium for sure on home turf. So I thought they had a great race really for a pretty inexperienced team, apart from John Collins, obviously. But yeah, no, it was very interesting. But top 10 strategies, they can be totally different, but end up with the same result. So it was a fascinating race.
How about the story behind Gym City AR? Did they pick up a 4th teammate down there? Like someone couldn't make it?
Haven't heard about that. Don't know about it.
Yeah, I heard there was a story that's going to come out of that their team had a final. They had to sort of throw a team together at the last minute and get them all out on the course, and they're doing very well. They're still out there. They're pushing the top 10 themselves.
Yeah.
So
a good
credit.
team. Actually, Estonia had a few problems with gear too, didn't they? Which probably impacted them a little bit as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The battle's getting to the race itself, right? And once you get started, off we go. Brent, what else you thinking?
I was just going to say a couple other teams that I think we mentioned these teams as well. I know Ben Canada, and Jason's probably watched them a little bit closer than I have in terms of the dots, but I know Canada seemed to have a uncharacteristically challenging start. They were a bit further back for the first half of the race than I expected, but I think they've really kind of rounded into form and have moved up a number of spots. So I've been impressed by them and are still watching them closely. I think one that I had mentioned in our pre-race was the team from Uruguay, right, who has a ton of experience in this race. And I was actually just looking at them again. They similarly were, a fair ways back, relatively speaking, and they've kind of moved up into the top 15 and have been kind of battling with that group around Ben Canada and Bozy from, I don't know how you pronounce Bozy's name, Bossy maybe from Colombia. And the thing I just noticed, however, is while they are sitting in technically, I think 14th or 15th place, they haven't updated in 8 hours. So there's a chance that Uruguay team is actually close to the end of the bike. And if that is the case, they could be poised to overtake Life for 11th place by the end of this thing, if that all plays out, right? So that's one I'm still watching closely and pretty excited by.
Yeah. And just to add a little flavor to the Uruguay team, Ruben I've known Ruben for a long time and raced against him a lot. And at least two of those teammates, maybe three of them were recently just in Sweden for the One Water race, which was the world's first expedition swim run. And that was like 3 weeks ago. Right. And, to tell a little story, honestly, Uruguay is just not one of those teams that wins with speed. They don't quite have the power of some of these top teams, but they're so tenacious. And, what I saw I was over there as well with, a kind of been racing team of local athletes. And when my team decided to drop out on this beach, Uruguay was, 6 hours behind us or something like that, missing the cutoff. They hobbled into this beach section and after hours and hours of 50 hours of swim run or something. And they got to the little boat there. And then the first thing they said is can we continue? like, like my team had decided to like drop out because there was too much pain and too much suffering. And the Uruguayans had like barely able to walk, and they hobbled in and like, can we continue? And then they came over to me and said, hey, we don't have any food left. All our food's gone. Do you have some food we could have? So we gave them our food, and they continued until they got pulled off the course. Right. So those guys are tough, and it's really great to see them doing so well. I know they've kind of had top 20 finishes in the World Championships before, but yeah, I'm rooting for them. Just like Brent, I'm like, why? They haven't tracked for like, I don't know, a long time. So I really expect to see them pop up in that top 15 for sure. And yeah, it's been a tremendous, it's kind of crazy knowing what the Swedish race was like. And I was talking to them over there, like, are you guys going to be fit for Worlds? And it's like, yeah, we'll be fine. We'll be fine. I'm like, okay, good luck. But obviously they're fit for Worlds. Like, they're doing great. So that's pretty exciting to see.
Are there stories that we've missed? We haven't talked about the middle of the course and how teams are doing. Teams are out there still slugging away, right? I mean, the trackers are slow to update, and that's just the nature of the beast with this kind of remote jungle access and things like that. A lot of teams still out there on the course. A lot of teams still trying to get in. What do you think teams are going through right now? They're 130 hours into the race, clock's ticking. They're probably fighting to stay on the course, right? They don't want it. You look at like a 72-hour trek, and then you look at a 19, 20 hours on the paddle. They're desperate to stay on the course. What do you think's going to happen to them? Are they going to be able to are they going to get transported to the finish? Are they going to be sent directly there? I mean, there's a lot of ground on this course. This isn't I'm probably going to miss some of those treks probably. Are they going to ride it into the finish? As race directors, what do you think is going to happen out there?
I think that this is a big enough course that, what I would like to hear is all of your guys' predictions, especially Brent and Craig, like who is going to carry the Lanterne Rouge position? Like who, it's always a question with these races because everybody thinks they're maybe going to finish. And then it becomes really clear at some point that the course is just so big that, if you're coming close to the cutoffs, you're done. It's a foregone conclusion that if you're barely making cutoffs, you're not going to make the next one. So who do you guys think is going to be the last full course team to finish? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I have a hard time with this because honestly, unfortunately, there's been so much chatter, and I don't say this with any criticism toward the race director. Sometimes technology just fails us, but this tracking platform has not been ideal. So at this point, the problem I'm having is I don't even really know who's at the back, right? So for example, Disability is still tracking at the end of the paddle. Right. I've seen online updates that they're moving on the short course, but also speculation that they're unofficial. They were briefly moved into the unofficial category. Now I see they're back on the full course, but they're also short course. So I don't know. Right. Like that just totally confuses me.
Yeah. Welcome to my world.
Yeah. Right, yeah.
Does it for a living.
This is not an answer. I'll look at it and think about it for the next couple of minutes, but like, I'm really just like, back to your question, Brian, like thinking about, man, these teams at the back, what their feet are going to look like. Cause, there's been some real carnage on those top teams. Like I know the second team from Estonia, the Honey, whatever they're called. Like there was a great story about they left on the second trek and had to come back. The woman on the team, her feet were in such bad shape. And I think they were like maybe preparing to drop out, and Heidi gave her a pair of her own shoes off her feet, I believe, because they were bigger, and they went out and they did it, but they've fallen way back. And so I'm just wondering, these teams that are still on that second trek, how are they doing? Right. And what are they going to look like by the end of this thing? So I don't know how many of these teams are going to get all the way around versus skipping those treks.
I haven't really looked at it too much in the last 24 hours, but it's pretty hard to predict. The tracking hasn't been ideal, but I would suggest probably less than 20 teams. I don't know how we're looking at the moment, but I just haven't had the time to really look that closely back in the pack. I was able to keep up to date with the leaders in between other things, but I haven't had the time to look further back. But
there's a team as of 25 minutes ago is still on the paddle.
Yeah, but they haven't updated, right, in a while.
Well, they updated at 104, and now we're at 129. So, that's right. So that's okay. So that's a long time there. Okay.
Yeah, I'm looking at, I know, just because of the Expedition Oregon, I know the some of the people from the AXA or AKSA Brazil, the Brazilian team. They're pretty strong racers, and they're sitting there accurately tracking it at CP 76. So they're on the bike. Before that, they've still got to do the bike and the trek to the finish line. But I don't imagine that any teams that are kind of not on that last bike are going to be able to finish, or not many more. Because they only have 170 hours is the final cutoff, or was it? I don't know what
is this Saturday at some point?
Yeah,
they have one more full day of racing, I think, in front of them. Yeah, right, because Paraguay's on the same time zone as the East Coast of America, so it's night there now.
I think they're an hour ahead of us, aren't they?
About 30, 36, or maybe 40 hours left of racing.
I mean, that's the real. I mean, all credit to Avaya and SAF. This is not like when they talk about the marathon runners, right? And the marathon runners, when the strong African runners, when they go and they're done in 3 hours and change, they say to themselves, "I couldn't imagine being on my feet for 5 hours." Like, they talk about that as how hard. I mean, the amount of time that these teams are going to be out there is it's breathtaking when you think about it. And they just keep slugging away. I mean, those are the real. All credit to Avaya and SAF and Brazil, and they deserve every ounce of credit they get. But that some of these teams coming into this race, they knew that they were going to get shelled. They knew this was going to be their future.
Yeah.
So, can I give a more concrete answer, Jason? So, listening to your thoughts on AXA. So I just looked up, the TA there at the end of the trek before that final bike. The teams that have all finished, right? So Avaya through Merrill, on average took 20-ish hours to finish the race from there. I think Avaya was fastest, around 15 roughly. A couple teams were back toward 30. So, if they've got, maybe 36 to 40 hours, maybe a little bit longer, depending on what time they're ending on Sunday, that makes me think that really the Lantern Rouge of the full course is actually probably one of the teams that's on maybe the second half of that trek. That, of course, requires them to navigate cleanly through that second half. That might even afford them an hour or two of sleep, and then they have to be pretty steady for the rest of the race. Yeah. But I would think that one of those teams will be our final finisher of the full course.
Right. So maybe Seti, or Seti has lots of world championships under the belt, and Papacara, Vitality. They're ranked ninth. I mean, they're
probably experienced teams like that. And the other thing, though, once you get into nights 5 and 6, teams really do need a little bit more sleep though as well. And they're just shattered. So I can tell that from experience.
So basically,
there's another team, Pioneers, that we haven't talked about. Pioneers that I just happen to know. One of the guys, it's a Swedish team, it's under the Swedish flag, but one of the guys on that team is Olaf Hedberg, who's actually used to race with AMK and I think got as high as second place or third place in world championships.
Yep.
And he said this is a bit more of a tenacity cruise with his Swedish teammates, but him and his wife, who are
Whitney.
Whitney. So, those guys definitely have potential to pull it out. When I saw that, I think it's got to be a little hard for him, and also rare, having previously been on the podium at World Championships. Now he's suffering an extra few days, but I hope they're having fun, and I think that they're committed to finishing based on
Very interesting how he compares it.
Exactly. I think from my experience. And obviously I'm no Avaya, but we've been spending a lot of time the last 5 years trying to get more competitive. And I will say 100% that everything is easier when you are reaching your goals, whether that's top 10 or winning or being on the podium. Those teams that reach their goals, the recovery is easier, 100%. That's not maybe it's psychosomatic, but every race that I've won or met my goals, it seems I got a pep in my step that next day, right? Whereas when you're shattered, like maybe the Estonians that ended up in fourth when they didn't imagine that possible, like it's pretty harsh, right? And so kudos to those teams that stick it out once their initial goals kind of go and come and pass, and they kind of have to redefine what it means to be racing. I think that's it's a huge part of growing as an athlete in the sport is sometimes sticking it out and realizing that it really isn't about the wins of the podium, but it's about, kind of the deeper stuff that you can learn out there. But man, it's not easy. So,
we went through that. I want to echo back to East Wind, right? East Wind is East Wind, right? They're legendary in the sport. And there's been a change in leadership in that team. And it was, dare I say, heartbreaking to see them have such a hard time so early in the race. The ambulance had to bring somebody out. They had a really hard time. And to your point, right on it, your heart goes out to these teams that do well. And to your point, when you're, success breeds success. We see that in adventure racing time and time again. And how many teams sort of gain speed and gain steam along the way, and then they have a tough race like this, and things really kind of work against them. Did any teams out there? And I'm going to come back to you, Craig, on this because I know that you've been watching it in terms of these teams so well. Looking down the road, you mentioned that next year that Merrill Songlines is going to be the strong team in Africa, right? They're going to be the Brazil of Africa. Anybody else here strike you as an overperformer during this race?
I think all the top 10, and actually slightly different crew this time. I mean, Quest, absolutely great to see them, Jason, and I wasn't surprised. And I actually felt after Oregon that the Canada team would have been up a little bit further as well, and they've definitely got a lot of potential there. So it really is good to see the American teams coming to the fore there a little bit. I'm just scratching my head a little bit just to think of the other top 10 teams there, but I think Songlines, and there'll be 2 or 3 other, I think, good South African teams next year who on home soil will actually be pushing top 10. So that will certainly mix things up a little bit next year. Just trying to think in the top 10 there. Yeah, I don't know. I think it was kind of pretty much as predicted, normally is. But the South American teams, it was really good to see Bossy and Uruguay do really well. And it wasn't really a surprise because they are so experienced. But on home soil, it's great to see them putting in a good performance and a great race. And actually, the other team, their South American team, might be Keltoy or something. They've done really well. And actually I saw the lady was in a video talking to Heidi at transition after, I think before the second track. So they'd already done the big track, the kayak, the first bike ride and such. She looked so fresh. She looked great, and just like, I thought, Craig, has she already been racing 2 days or has she just stepped out onto the course? Because she looked fantastic and they've raced really well. So yeah, I think next year, looking ahead to next year, there'll be the usual candidates, but there are some younger teams starting to come through. I think the other Estonian team might learn from this experience and be better next time. And Nordisk and other teams, and I mean, European, there'll probably be more European teams there next year. So yeah, there'll be good teams from Europe that will go down to Africa and perform quite well in the top 20 mix for sure.
Greg, thank you for that. We're getting near the end of our time. What's the closing thoughts here? Brent, I'm going to turn to you. Any closing thoughts that we have going into the end of the race? It's still going on, right? There's still teams that are out there. There's more to talk about. Now that the race is sort of shook out for the podium and you're looking at those top, close to the top 10 teams. Any closing thoughts?
I feel like we've covered pretty much all the things that I was watching this past week. I think that as we expected, that opening 48 to 50 hours was a pretty rough start to the race. I think it was hard. I mean, I think when you see a team like Avaya come across the finish line and they're asked to reflect on the race and they immediately talk about how hard and brutal that trek was, like, that tells you something about what everyone else was going through as well, right? When the top teams are remarking on how hard something like that is, it's for real. I really appreciated Jason's comment from early in our conversation, just about the race director thought process. And, it's not always as conscious as we sometimes think it is in in retrospect, I sometimes think race directing is a bit like art, right? And, people can sit down and look at a painting and they're like, oh, well, this is what the creator intended. And they're like, no, that's not it at all. I just did it this way because I felt like it. Right. And, with race directing, sometimes like, it's what the land gives you. But I also like, don't at all want to suggest that that's what it was. Like, I think it ended up being a really fascinating course to watch unfold. So kudos to the entire team down there for putting together what's clearly a pretty challenging, exciting event.
Exactly. Jason, what do you think? Take us out.
So yeah, I'm gonna a little segue. Like I was talking to the guy, the founder of Gear Junkie, Stephen Reginald, after nationals. So I just raced at nationals. He raced at nationals, and we were having a conversation over ice cream afterwards. And about what it would take for adventure racing to grow, and kind of get back to its heyday and that kind of thing. And he made a comment, and I think his place is mostly as an American kind of seeing the sport in the US. He said, hey, what we need in adventure racing is more elite athletes, more top athletes. And, and inside I'm like, you couldn't put 4 of the most elite athletes on the planet together right now that would beat Avaya in this race. Right. And that's what I love about the World Championships. And especially, this is different. We're not talking 24-hour racing. We're talking expedition racing. It's a different beast. And this is such a remarkable sport. And it's so hard. I remember when my twin brother, who's also a longtime expedition racer, wrote an article for some New Zealand magazine about like why more people didn't adventure race. And the reality is because it's hard and because most people fail. Like you fail and you fail and you fail and you fail, and you have to figure out how to not fail or how to change your mindset about what failure is, because it is so unbelievably hard. And there are very, very few teams that can do it well. And then you see even the best teams in the world, like in this race, fail and fall apart. And, it just brings me back to this idea that expedition racing is more than a sport. Yeah, sure, it's an elite sport. It's one of the hardest things you'll ever do, in your life, but it really takes 4 humans that can do the exceptional. And that is not the case in a lot of sports where it's just physical, or can I go faster? Can I go longer? Really is an exceptional feat to be able to not only finish one of these races, but to be competitive with a bunch of other people that have decided that this is the best thing that they can do with their time. And it's just remarkable. It's like remarkable to watch. When I'm sitting there watching it, even as 60 expeditions under my belt, I'm like, how are they still going? They should all be miserable. Like, I'm so glad I'm not there. I heard that from so many people watching Expedition Oregon. I'm so glad I'm not there. And then you talk to the teams that did it, and they're just like, I'm so glad I was there. Right. And it's just a crazy thing that the people that are out there going through that they don't begrudge any step, any sense of pain, any failure, that they walk to that finish line and they're like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever done. And when am I going to do it again? Right. And to me, that speaks volumes to this community, this sport, this life that we've all created for ourselves under the crazy guise of adventure racing. And, it's just like so amazing to see those teams go through that, see those people, those humans go through that. And I'm just super thankful to be part of it. And, and that all of them are surviving and doing what they love out there.
So I'll tell you this. So last night I had the chance to interview David Webster. David Webster raced in Itera, Scotland as part of team ACDC AR. And they were literally the middle of the pack team that finished. What's fascinating about his interview and speaking with him, it was his first adventure race ever. Mm-hmm. It was a 5-day Itera, Scotland. And I asked him, like, well, why did you jump into that deep end of the water? Like, why did you choose to do this? And he said, because he saw Eco Fiji, right? That's Gateway for People. And he talked a lot about how he wanted to test himself. He wanted to see if he could do it or not. And his team did it. They did great, right? They were a short course team in Itera. And they put all the pieces together. And he spoke about it as such a transformative experience for himself that he really wanted to kind of show himself what he was. And the fact that was his first race, he dove right into the deep end of the pool. Brent, now that I think about it, I do want to wrap up with you. You have an expedition race on the horizon, right? June of 2023, we're bringing back the Endless Mountains for the second time, right? Inaugural race. There are people listening to this podcast that are going to kick around possibly getting into adventure racing and getting into long form racing. As you look towards the future and you look towards the race that you're putting together along with Abby, I know that you designed the courses together. What does this race say to you about what you want to bring to the racer experience going into next year?
Yeah, and don't end with me. Make sure you end with Craig. He deserves it. I'm just saying. So I mean, it's a great question. Obviously, like racing in Pennsylvania is a completely different animal than doing a race like this. Totally different ecosystem and climate, different maps. I mean, everything's different, right? And also, like, it should be noted, we're not directing a world championship. So while I do remind people that it is a World Series event, which means it is definitely going to be more challenging than your average kind of regional 72-hour event, we really want to make sure that the event is kind of accessible and doable by, I won't say anyone, because it's not, right? Like, you have to prepare for a 5-day race. Like, there's no way around that, right? But, we really like to try to put together a course that really does kind of suit all levels. So I think I would just say that, right? And watching this, like, it's a little hard to tell what happens, but like, also, this is a different kind of race, right? Like, this is a more traditional, point to point event. It's a world championship event. I don't think it's necessarily supposed to necessarily have this like tremendous focus on what happens when you're short course. You skip things, right? When you're short course, you do have to kind of move forward on the course. So, I did want to also just say, though, to Jason's comment about failure, right? We unfortunately didn't get to talk about one of our favorite teams much because they had a really rough race. And I would actually like to end my own thoughts with Eastwind again, right? Because, if you're not familiar, people that are listening, if you're not familiar with Eastwind, do yourself a favor and go back and find yourself, the original Eco Challenge from Australia. I think it was the 1997 edition. And just watch it. And, that's when Eastwind kind of appeared on the international scene. And, there's been some changes in the team over the years, but, even though they had a difficult race here, they continued to embody what that team has always embodied. So for those that didn't follow, one of their teammates became, or maybe even started the race ill. It's not clear to me exactly what happened, but he clearly was quite ill quite early in the event. They had to stop less than 24 hours into the race. They stopped for maybe 24 hours. Essentially, we're at the very back of the pack as a result, fell 24 hours behind everybody. They had already fallen way behind because they weren't moving well. They finally were able to evacuate their sick teammate. I think for a lot of teams at that point, like, you're already basically 30 hours behind where you wanted to be. Like, you're not finishing the race officially. You're not going to be able to finish the full course, most likely. Most teams probably get on the bus or the train or the helicopter, whatever they brought in there to get their teammate out, and they go home. And Eastwind does what they always do, right? They got up and they kept going, right? And that's another big takeaway for me. It's just a reminder, right, of what makes this sport so amazing and what makes a successful adventure racer. Their tracker, I think, is currently dead. No idea how they're doing at this point, but they like got up and they ran through the rest of that first stage. They caught up and passed, I think, like 10, 12 teams, and had a great time doing it from all accounts. So I just think the spirit of it is, there's nowhere better than the World Championship to see the spirit of the sport.
Yeah. Thank you. Craig, you probably have the most adventure racing knowledge of this whole pack, all of us. You've seen a lot of World Championships, a lot of thoughts. Close us out. Take us home. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a great race and it was a great result. And I mean, you can't take anything away from Avaya. They are the world's best and will remain that way for a little while, I guess. But I want to go back and touch on what the guys just touched on as well about adventure racing in general, and the fact that, I was a really bad racer. I've been short coursed. I've been out there for 6.5, 7 days and loved every minute of it. And it might seem like they're battling along and such things, but they're still in the bubble. They're still in the zone. They're still enjoying it. And I think the big takeaway for anyone who jumps in the deep end of adventure racing, whether they succeed or not, or reach those goals or not, it's the self-belief you come away with that if you can take this on and survive it, let alone whether you finish it full course, short course, whatever, it's the self-belief you get from taking it on, and that you can do anything is possible, and that's a pretty unique thing to get from the sport, and it's a great thing to take into life.